dollars out of the government and ourselves either for the next lot, so they should think about that. Okay, all those in favour, please say aye. Carried. Thanks very much for that Recovery Office update. Now we've got an interim guidance for the decisions on the land acquired from these results. Now this is another more complicated version of downstream of exactly what we've been talking about for a while. So I presume you've all read this, and I think the 7 principles look reasonably sensible, so we'll try and discuss any questions you've got about the 7 principles, because I think that's what you're trying to get some advice from us as to whether you think they're good, but they look okay to me. Off you go.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I just have a couple of quick slides. Let me take you through this really, really quickly. So look, you've got the report in front of you, and the attachment is that 1-page or 2-pager of the interim guidelines about what we're going to do in terms of when land has been purchased through the recovery process, that future use of that land. So as we've told you before, at least 700, possibly more, Category 3 properties are likely to be purchased over the coming year or so. And obviously, though, that land has got some natural hazards associated with it. So we need to decide what to do with it ultimately. Clearly, we will firstly deconstruct, so remove any buildings. Clearly, we will also keep buildings such as retaining walls and other things that might be needed from a management of risk perspective, but otherwise we're looking to deconstruct as much as possible, clear the site, and really just maintain it to a basic level. In terms of how we are holding that land kind of internally, we do want to make sure we're holding that in a kind of a separate asset class, just so that we know what we're doing with it and we make the right decisions at the right time. This is just a kind of initial thinking really about the assessment process when considering what we do with these pieces of land. We'll clearly have to understand that the land, it will be a little bit different in different circumstances, and the risk on that land will also be different in different circumstances, and therefore the kind of feasible uses could change. There could be, ultimately, if there was work done, it could still be available for redevelopment, or it could have some other use associated with it. It could be used for something very passive and really no use at all. So there's a range of options, and this interim policy, which we said we report back to you on, is our first attempt really to at least frame up how we make those decisions. There is a whole bunch of other stuff going on. We've mentioned a number of these over time, and even this morning with you. There is a possible plan change with the unitary plan, the Making Space for Water program, and various other mitigation works, investments and processes that we work through. So we know all of this sits in context. And so the document that we have attached to the report has an objective to obviously manage responsibly, efficiently and effectively this land that we purchase. There are 7, as the Mayor has said, there are 7 principles for those, and this slide just kind of frames that up quite broadly to say we want to manage the risks, we want to make good use of the land depending on the characteristics of that land, and we want to follow the right processes in doing that, particularly being transparent to communities and working with communities, our mana whenua partners, about the ultimate use of that land. We are, in putting this in place, that allows us really to, in the next year or so, to, if we need to make decisions about the land use, we can do so, but we're working on a more comprehensive policy and implementation plan on this. But in the interim, this is what we think should guide our decisions. That's it, Mr. Mayor, thanks.
Okay, well, I think one of the things that's missing from that, right at the top, should be should get as much money back as we can out of the process. And that's what's missing, because that's minimising the funds that everyone else who wasn't involved in this has to put in. And so there are communities who weren't flooded who've got a right to say something or other. And so what's missing to me is who decides these things and where is the market? Because I can tell you, if we put 5 of our staff in a room and say, what are you going to do with this? You won't get the same answers if you put it out to the marketplace. The marketplace will tell you whether there is another involvement in this or not. Some people see uses and pieces of land which we don't dream up. And so I would like to see the market involved in this. And one of our principles is that we return as much cash as possible. Otherwise, you're just going to end up with more and more bloody parks that we're going to have to rate people to run. Where a park is the best solution is a good idea. But we're going to end up with bits of land all over the place. And I want to see that those people are involved. Councillor Turner is frowning at me. He probably doesn't want to have the market involved there, but then again,
it's not about...
it is out west where they don't have...
Through the chair, could I just respond just to say, just before Councillor Turner, Principle 5, to be prudent with ratepayers' money, is probably our passive-aggressive way of saying make the best use of money, and where we can, we should make money, resell, do all of the things that you're talking about. So there is a little bit of description under item 5 that talks to exactly your point, but happy to take
Well, I think
further feedback. Yeah, I understand.
make it a bit more blunt. Be prudent with ratepayers' money is what we're trying to tell him to do and reduce his costs. But not just be prudent with ratepayers' money, it's actually get some of the cash back or maximise the value of the property. It'd probably be the best way to say that. We need to maximise the value of the property. And remember, some of these ongoing things will come with a cost. And so if we're preparing the cost of something or other, and it's going to be a long, ongoing cost, that is a negative to that as well. So if you can pass it off to somebody else and make them run the ongoing cost, that's even better. Councillor Turner, who wants to buy all the land around his farm out in West Auckland, is now going to get in with a question.
Well, I don't think that I should be allowed to buy it at market values off the council to farm and make a profit out of when the council's taken it from the public in the first place because they said it was a serious risk to life.
The public have volunteered to do that, and what's a risk of life is okay for you to put your cows on.
Okay, so I'll wait for the debate, Mr. Mayor. But look, well, I understand that there is a lot of complexity in this, but I do, and it needs to be talked about more off, in some sort of, we don't want to work through it here, but I do think that we have to be very careful about what we do with land that we've brought off people because we said it had too high a risk to be used by them. And I point out Councillor Henderson made the comment a couple of meetings ago that he helped to make sure that a place in West Auckland, I think it was number 12, thank you, Western Road, which was taken because it was flooded, sat there for a decade and then was going to be sold again. And so there's a lot to be talked about. I agree, Mr. Mayor, we want to be as prudent as possible with the money, but it's more complex than just that.
Look, and all I can say is I agree. That's exactly why we need to think carefully about it. If there is still a risk to life, even with removing buildings and removing everything on it, then we cannot then put a use on that which would, continue that risk. So that's exactly the kind of stuff we need to weigh up.
Or that the previous owner could have potentially made more money selling to the marketplace for doing that purpose than we have given them for what we took.
But that's an option for what he's got now. Well, there's hardly a question, but we're having discussions because someone put up a sign saying discussion. That bugged me up. Councillor Henderson.
I was going to say I reserve my right to speak, actually, given the timing, though. Look, 2 questions. Have you considered community involvement in this? Because it won't work everywhere, but I can imagine places like Karekare, there will be community interest and there will be people saying, look, hang on, we can lead a community garden or something like that.
Through the chair, so yeah, principles 6 and 7, particularly in relation to mana whenua partnerships, but also communities as well. We want to work with them where it's possible. To your point, it won't always be possible or relevant, but where possible, we do want to work with them about that future use. It can be for more community purposes, or it might just be to the level of them understanding, our decisions or where we're going and getting their feedback on it. So, yep, absolutely.
Thank you. Second and final question. Have we considered just chucking trees all over it? I mean, the urban ngahere strategy is there and ready to use. It will improve soil quality, it will improve air quality, and surely it's not going to take a lot of OPEX to maintain.
But it could increase
I'm sure it
flooding.
will take more OPEX than we think. But yes, that is all part of the mix. So that, you would describe that, I guess, as some kind of open or passive space or public space, and yes, we could just put trees on it. That could be inappropriate. Yep, it could be appropriate.
There's quite a few fell down last night, actually, costing the council or something, so that is a thought. Councillor Newman.
To what extent is this going to create the future liability for council when we start to have to go through an acquisition decision in relation to properties developed in accordance with what we have consented, in accordance with the decisions that we, the council, have mandated as part of our consenting process? I can see that the only way that effectively this could work would be to effectively acquire this land, but to acquire this land for a change of use process. Largely it will have to be to create drains and what have you to attenuate stormwater, which I understand, but the land sometimes will be land in the future which will have to be acquired because the land use activities which preceded it at the time of acquisition are land use activities that we consented to have take place, and there'll be people who'll be extremely aggrieved because they will consider that we are responsible not only for the acquisition but for the loss of value that we had initially agreed as part of that consenting exercise.
Through the chair, I can only agree with that in the sense that this was always an implication of the policy that the government put in to deal with this awful event, and we were always going to get to this point. And I don't know some of the answers to your or to the points you're raising. They're absolutely valid. This was always a risk with it, and we are just needing, as Matt and the team are moving through the categorisation and all of that, we will similarly need to move through this with you over the coming months to work all this through.
So can I ask, so the land would be acquired effectively the land, if you're going to take urban residential land, zone land and acquire it, to turn it back into effectively a basin for stormwater, we're effectively purchasing it based on its current zoning, but then are we subsequently rezoning that particular parcel of land to reflect what we understand will need to be its future change of use? I mean, that is the thing that ultimately will have to determine what is its future land use. It's the zoning that underpins it. It's not just our acquisition of it.
So under the current process for Category 3, we are acquiring it based on the market value just prior to the event in January. So that is trying to deal with that matter about the reflection of the zoning and the situation that was. Then it becomes our property, and we may choose to rezone it to reflect a land use, or we may just use it for a land use and not change the zoning. Again, lots of different situations, and that's what we need to work through.
If I may, Chair, one more thing, but the concern that I have is if we don't change the underlying zoning to reflect the new use, then at some point someone's going to come along in the future, oh look, we've got all these parcels of these land, shit, we're in a financial crunch, let's just flick them off, because I've seen that before. We flick it all off to try and address this year's budget crunch, and all of a sudden we put out to the market a whole lot of stuff that we know is going to flood, based on a zoning that we know is not appropriate. Or we parcel these things, we actually need a fast track way of rezoning that land as quickly as we acquire it, to try and avoid what I think would be that future risk, because I can see that, I can just see people in the future looking at it as an opportunity.
Agree,
that's what I
understand.
meant.
Yep.
That will have to be picked up as a piece of planning work for a further report back. I can understand the principles, but we will need to address a fast track for rezoning of that land.
Look, and that's exactly why we want to do a bit of an interim policy, but that's exactly the work we need to do with you, and that's a big part of it. Yeah, agree.
Councillor Hills, please.
Thank you. And yeah, Councillor Newman's point, that will be part of our hazards plan change, which we're waiting on the changes for plan change 78 on. A lot of that will inevitably fall into those areas that we end up going out to consultation on, but whether you can capture it all is the issue. The question, and it is to the Mayor's point, I guess it does need to be part of the mix, but I guess could you explain, I was at a community cluster yesterday of houses around a cliff falling down, but it's connected to our reserve. We wouldn't be trying our best to sell land parcels like that. This is going to be, I guess where this is coming from is I don't want the community out there who are going through opt-out processes now thinking that our main priority is to sell this land again, because that is not our priority, that's not the policy. It may happen in some areas, but could I have an understanding of how that would happen? Because the areas in our community where slips have happened, it would be outrageous for the community to think we're just buying it to sell it when it's so unsafe.
Look, from a staff perspective, it's clearly not the intention to resell all of these properties. The policy, though, and the work with government and the way that they framed it does not preclude that if it's appropriate. And there will be situations where by removing the current situation, whether that's because of the location of a building or any other matter, that land, or there could be some other infrastructure works that is done in and around that catchment, would mean that land does into the future has avoided or reduced that level of risk down to something that is less than intolerable risk to life. So that could be a situation where the council could choose to put that back on the market as resale because that risk has been removed to an appropriate extent. But that is, the selling of property is not the main focus here. It is not precluded, though, where the circumstances are appropriate.
I think you can be assured that we'll approach this with a lot of care and sensitivity.
Thank you.
When I say sale, I didn't mean going back on the market. There's a lot of situations whereby, for instance, someone's got a house on a cliff, the house next door has gotten itself in a bit of trouble. I wouldn't put itself back on the market if someone else bought another house in a stupid place like that. But the people next door might quite like to buy it for increasing their gardens. So you don't go back on the market, you approach the neighbours. And so, and what we wanted to do, a prime goal isn't necessarily to sell everything, but to reduce the cost is an obvious prime goal. And if you don't have that, you're going to end up with gorsebush quarter sections all over the bloody place. And so that's what's behind what I'm thinking. I don't know, you just have, this has been done plenty of times elsewhere too, and this is not new. So I'm not seeing as a whole big marketplace here, but we've got to be alert to reducing our ongoing costs, and somebody else's ownership's a much better one. Councillor Ferry.
Thanks. So my question was I thought Shane had asked it, but then when I looked at the stuff and thought about what you said, I think maybe he didn't quite ask it. So I'm going to give it another go, which is the potential here for some temporary use. So when you said community gardens, I was thinking, oh yeah, temporary use. And then I had a look again at the principles and was like, actually, there is nothing in there about temporary use. And I think that is something that we should consider. Because, you know, some of these, it's going to be years before we know exactly what we're doing with the land, and then also we do what we're going to do with the land, right? So I'd like to see some consideration of temporary use, and I think also being really upfront with communities about those temporary use conversations. So, for example, you know, if a community comes and says, hey, we want to put a community garden on the site, and we decide that that is an appropriate use, but we are upfront with them, okay, but in 10 years' time, we're going to be doing something else with this land, because that's when you run into problems, right? Where community like, well, we've had our community garden here for years and we thought we'd be able to continue. So it's just being really upfront. So is that something that can be encompassed in the way that we're putting this together now?
Through the chair, yes, I believe it does, because this again is in this interim use of the land.
Yep.
As always, all of this relates to risk. So let us assume that there is a piece of land where, say, something like using for use of a community garden, that risk is appropriate. Then, yep, all these principles remain the same. We can talk with the community. They may say we'd really like a community garden if we think that's the appropriate thing. It can all, yep. So it's absolutely enabled by this. The risk is always the thing that we'll need to come back to ultimately, for whether it's an interim or temporary use or a long-term use.
Cool. And I guess just to clarify also, often when council talks about temporary, we mean 5 to 10 years. Other people in other contexts often think that only means like 1 to 2 years. So we just need to be really clear about setting expectations in that space. The other query I had was around the ability to redraw some of these land parcels. So, you know, for example, I'm aware of one near the rail line in Mount Albert. They've been given a Category 3. I suspect their neighbours some of them will probably get Category 3s as well. It may be that once we design whatever the infrastructure is going to be, that reduces the risk to that there are some parts of a big parcel across multiple properties that we can then carve off and say, actually, we know now this is safe for housing. And I guess also I'm thinking about the role of local boards in property optimisation as well, because they will end up potentially being the inheritors of some of this land. So are we thinking about that, or is it sort of a bit too early for that aspect?
We're thinking of it in the overall terms. We've not been specific about, you know, subdivision, but again, that's the work we need to do in this bigger piece of policy to work with you. So yeah, it's on our radar, but it is a possibility. We've done no particular thinking about it.
And so the consideration, though, of the fact that a lot of this land will fall to local boards and they obviously have their separate optimisation process, I just want some reassurance that that's being considered.
Yes, and into this bigger policy or this more permanent policy. Yep.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Councillor Turner wants another crack? No comment. Hey?
Have a chance to comment, please, Mr Mayor.
We have been commenting because we got to the thing in assignment up saying discussion, so off you go, comment. And then Councillor Lee wants to comment as well.
So I just want to point out that in West Auckland I'm dealing with many people who didn't want to leave their property, who have chosen to go down the buyout path really to get out of 18 months worth of uncertainty and angst. And if we're saying that there are engineering options ahead of us that could fix these properties and put them back into a residential use, that is a very risky place to go to. I thought this buyout was to make space for water and to improve to improve the next tier of houses behind the ones we're buying out, so they don't sit in the same situation. So and we do have to do it as fiscally responsible as we can. Thank you.
Any response to that? No. Councillor Lee.
Thank you. I'm just a little bit concerned at what I'm hearing this morning. I'm very supportive of the concept of making space for water. The floods of early 2023 were actually a tragedy for Auckland. especially for those Aucklanders who lost their lives and their families, and also the people who lost their homes. And I thought the making space for water concept was something that was quite visionary, that we could in some ways take away from this tragedy. And I think there was a lot of support around the governing body and also in the community for this concept. I just get the impression that we're kind of backpedaling and equivocating on the making space for water vision and talking about re-engineering and flogging the land off for whatever purpose. I think we must remember that a lot of these properties were damaged. Many of them were infill properties made because of poor or expedient planning decisions. But okay, those decisions and those mistakes were made. It would be kind of reinforce the tragedy if we were to not learn lessons from those bad judgments of the past and go back on the market again. We know, I don't know, is it 600 million that Panuku is expected to make from land sales, which was acquired by not this council, but its predecessors for various good reasons. And I'd hate to see a repetition of that. So it's important that we articulate what we really mean by making space for water and how much land will be included in that concept, and to think carefully and start focusing on how this will be managed as a sort of a regional park, obviously something quite different from a standard regional park, but in terms of protecting the waterways and enhancing the biological values, life-supporting capacity of those waterways, a real opportunity to do something different and something visionary. And so, you know, speccing on land and selling it to the neighbours and so on, I don't think that's going to impress the people of Auckland. They would much prefer to take from the tragic events of 2023 a vision and the making space for water idea, which manages, I think Healthy Waters dreamed it up, perhaps it was Mr. McElroy. But it was a good concept, and I think we need to pursue that with a lot of commitment. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think that we are making space for waters. That does include making some land available that will be made safe as a result of making space for waters. It's not just some sort of a phony developer's effort. And I'm sure Craig McElroy will be quite happy to explain it to you. It is a very serious project and we all do support it. And Councillor Deputy Mayor Simpson will now have her say. He doesn't want to have a say. Councillor Simpson will have his say.
No, Councillor Henderson.
Henderson, rather. I'm losing the plot there. Sorry, I was mesmerised by the last speech.
Goodness, thank you. Yeah, look, I'll be really quick because we've got a long day. Just want to thank staff for the hard work really briefly. I do need to keep pointing out there's a distinction that we need to keep in our minds between flood-affected communities and slip-affected communities. So we talk a lot about flooding here. We don't necessarily talk so much about people that have been affected by slips and isolated and all those horrible things. So just want to point that out and just keep it in your mind as decision makers, everybody. Look, just another shout out in terms of my questioning earlier. If we're working with communities, you know, places like Karekare and Piha, they have people there and community groups there that would pick up and run something like this and would really be up for a conversation and a partnership in terms of temporary uses, community gardens, things that will actually heal the wairua of that community as well. So it's just something to throw into the mix. We need to work really closely with local boards as well. It's another thing we got to do. The other thing that I've been thinking about is involving previous owners in those conversations, because in a lot of cases that the land that we have purchased off them has huge emotional ties, It's places where they've raised their families, those kind of things. For us to do something with the perception of unilateral decision making would be quite damaging, both to those individual families and the wider communities. So where they're up for it, because sometimes they won't want to, or they'll want to get out or be too emotional to handle it. But if they're up for it, we should build that into the process, I think. And very, very finally, I do just want to point out again, this is an opportunity for us to increase, our environmental outcomes and our climate change outcomes. So think about things like how can we increase our tree cover. That's another thing we've got to do, I think. So thanks, Mayor.
All good points. And everyone wants to go faster, of course. Councillor Darby.
Yeah, I want to reiterate the point that Councillor Henderson has made here. I think this is a terrific opportunity, and I don't think I've quite glimpsed that until now, actually, because we have been focused on the issue of water. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity here before us to look at a whole new landscape palette that is presented by this problem. So my urging is maybe we need to be looking at that title again, making space for water. Maybe this is a making space for nature, making space for new ecosystems in the urban environment, making space for wetlands. 95% of New Zealand's wetlands have been lost. In the Tamaki, Auckland area, they've almost entirely been lost. I think it's much higher than that. I think it's about 98%. It's making space for the stream systems, making space for revegetation of cliff tops that we've known are so fragile for such a long time. Making space for cooling the city, making space for greening the city, making space for bird life, and all the invertebrate life that sits under that most of us don't recognise, but that is, a healthy ecosystem in the urban environment. So I'd be really interested in, as we progress this work, and maybe the rebranding of this as a making space for nature in our city, which includes water, but there's a lot more available for us. Thank you.
Councillor Ferry, please.
Thanks. Just really quickly wanted to put in a bid for the consideration of involvement of local boards, mana whenua and broader community in how we do go forward with these pieces of land, both temporary use and longer term. In terms of, I'd like to see the organisation working on sort of a suite of options that could be considered once we know risk profiles, what would be appropriate in particular places. Could include some of the ideas that Councillor Darby's raised there about from a natural perspective. Could also include things like pump tracks, and we mentioned community gardens before. So yeah, turning this around in terms of the opportunity, but just, I guess, putting a punt in there for local boards, mana whenua and the community to be real leaders and enabled by the organisation with a really good set of advice and options and timeframes as we move forward with this. Thanks.
Okay, I'll move the interim guidance. The comprehensive recommendation here is that we develop and bring back the policy to us. So for those, we're not approving it just yet. And so if you've got something to say, contact Matt's team, Nick Vigar and others, and have your say into that there, and to help with the development of this. But it was a very good start. It was a good debate. I'll move it. It's seconded by the deputy. All those in favour, please say aye. To the contrary, thank you very much for a very good debate there. And we're going to go to Hukura funding. And I'd welcome James and Alistair, who've managed